Thank you for having me. Everyone here all right? Okay. So my paper's called Crip, Autonomy and External Limitations, and I'm taking the term Crip from Crip theory of Robert McCruers. So without further ado, this paper will argue that analysing the British government's response to the coronavirus pandemic can shed a light on the devaluation of disabled people and of their autonomy in UK neoliberal society. The paper will examine the changes to daily life that the government has imposed to manage the pandemic and question how these changes elucidate a wider disregard of disabled people. This paper uses the umbrella term disabled to include all neuro-diverse people and everyone with a chronic illness or impairment. This signifies a political commonality between these groups and highlights their shared marginalisation. This paper will first situate the experience of disabled people in relation to the broader restrictions caused by UK lockdown measures. While I recognise the widespread impact of these measures, the restrictions placed on disabled people and their autonomy testify and contribute to ableism, the belief system that discriminates in favour of the productive, autonomous citizen and disregards those who cannot meet this ideal. To enrich my analysis of ableism at work in governmental pandemic measures, I'll sketch a recent manifestation of ableism in the UK, the radical restructuring of disability benefits. The final part of this paper will examine changes to working practices and potentially unequal access to healthcare and the impact of the Coronavirus Act 2020 on the Care Act 2014. Section 1, COVID-19 and external restrictions. At the time of writing, the UK is under lockdown, which has had an impact on the public and their capacity to make autonomous decisions. Social distancing is being enforced, and the police have powers to intervene when it's disregarded. Significantly, the lockdown's impact on individuals and their autonomy is shaped by the individual's status, life, characteristics, and the form of marginalisation they experience. First, the pandemic's effect on individuals will be influenced by their careers and finances. Key workers must continue working outside of their homes and are sometimes obliged to work under unsafe conditions. Some self-employed workers are ineligible for governmental grants and are struggling with living costs. Domestic violence in the UK has risen under lockdown, and some of those experiencing it are struggling to access the services they require. According to current figures, this rise in domestic violence has predominantly affected women and children. Other marginalised groups have also been made vulnerable due to the pandemic, either in terms of increased mortality or of difficulty maintaining their human rights. Research undertaken by The Guardian has shown that Black, Asian and minority ethnic people are dying in disproportionately high numbers compared with white people, and the government has been urged to recognise that race and racial inequalities are a risk factor for COVID-19. Equally, Elizabeth Truss's comments to the Women and Equality Select Committee made during the first days of lockdown suggest that proposed reforms to the Gender Recognition Act may adversely affect transgender people. Those who experience multiple forms of marginalisation may consequently be impacted by the pandemic in several intersecting ways. For example, BAME key workers will be likely to have an increased risk of mortality from COVID-19 because of racial inequality and because of their public-facing roles. Section 2, Ableism in the UK. As Jessica Saffer, Lizette Nolte and Simon Duffy argue, changes to disability benefits in the United Kingdom can be defined as a political act and must be understood in the context of a range of different developments, some of which are specific to disabled people, while others relate to broader ideological or economic factors. During the era of austerity measures, the government discontinued the Independent Living Fund in England and Wales, replaced the Disability Living Allowance with Personal Independence Payment, or PIP, and cut social care. The UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities argued that these measures constituted systematic violations of the rights of disabled people and called for the benefit cuts that came through the 2012 and 2016 Welfare Reform Acts to be reversed. Significantly, although the change to PIP was expected to create a saving of £2 billion, this estimate has been revised to a £2 billion overspend. Therefore, keeping PIP in place once predictions had been revised could be seen as an ideological choice on the part of a government critical of the welfare state, rather than as a necessity motivated by financial deficit. Section 3. Ableism, external limitations, and the coronavirus pandemic. It's the main section of the paper. I now examine 3 areas of change to everyday life brought about by the governmental response to the pandemic. These are an increased reliance on remote working, changes in access to healthcare, and an altered provision of social care due to the Coronavirus Act. In the first and second stages of lockdown, the UK government encouraged employers to make every effort to support working from home. It's a quote. Notably, the resulting availability of remote working can be positive for disabled people. For example, working from home can allow one to avoid an inaccessible commute. However, as Pierre Brown argues, it is telling that remote working has suddenly become possible, when prior to the pandemic, disabled people were told they could not be hired solely to work from home. As Brown observed, obviously we're living in extraordinary times. However, what does it say to the disabled applicants these places previously rejected, as recently as a few months ago? For me, it said, "You are not as valuable to us as they are, and you will never be." Make no mistake, not allowing remote work until the threat of a pandemic is ableist. Like Brown, I believe that enabling people to work from home is essential to manage the coronavirus pandemic, and I commend employers for making that possible. However, I also share Brown's criticism of a system which, despite legislation like the Equality Act in the UK or the ADA in the US, does not oblige employers to make every effort when it comes to disabled people's careers. The shift to remote working has also presented significant challenges for some disabled employees in the UK. Under the Equality Act, an employer is required to make reasonable adjustments for disabled employees. As the FAQ section of Business Disability Forum indicates, however, some employers appear unwilling to make adjustments for disabled employees working from home, despite their legal obligations. Disabled people who have obtained reasonable adjustments at work may have to renegotiate with their employers to retain their rights when working from home. The FAQs on Business Disability Forum also suggest that some employers would like to use the furlough system to avoid providing reasonable adjustments for disabled employees. As the FAQs warn, employers who furlough only disabled employees could be open to a case for disability discrimination. To summarise, the systems put in place before and after the shift to remote working suggest that disabled people have to fight for employment and for the tools that allow them to work, despite the existence of the Equality Act. Further, while I welcome the Act's emphasis on reasonable adjustments for disabled employees, it is disquieting that some employers seek to circumvent this legislation by using tools such as the furlough system in a discriminatory fashion. Before exploring healthcare provision, I want to stress that according to the recently released ONS figures, around 22,500 disabled people died of COVID-19 between the 2nd of March and the 15th of May, compared to around 15,000 non-disabled people. This disparity has understandably led to calls for an urgent inquiry into the treatment of disabled people with coronavirus. Concerns about disabled people's access to treatment for coronavirus were also aroused by media coverage of elderly and disabled patients being pressurised to sign Do Not Resuscitate orders. Dr. Rachel Clark MD published a Guardian article arguing that the coverage of this issue was misleading. She states that CPR is an aggressive and traumatic process which is inappropriate for some patients, and adds that in the UK, the decision not to administer CPR rests with physicians. Dr. Clark's article does help to counter misinformation about end-of-life care. and her insistence that patients only receive appropriate care is not exceptional, as doctors routinely decide which treatments are suitable for their patients. Yet, if a decision about end-of-life care is taken by a medical practitioner without regarding a patient's wishes, the patient's capacity for autonomous decision-making is clearly being reduced. After all, a patient might reasonably say that even if CPR is likely to be futile, they would still like a practitioner to make the attempt. In addition, Dr. Clark's article does not address the NICE clinical frailty scale, a guide which suggests which treatment should be administered to UK patients with coronavirus, depending on their baseline health. The clinical frailty scale initially appeared to be compulsory, and there was a lack of clarity regarding the treatment of those who had care needs but who did not meet all of the scale's criteria for frailty. After legal challenges, NICE amended the guidelines to promote individualised treatment, which accounted for differing needs among people who fit some but not all of the scale's criteria. As Peter Todd, a partner at the legal firm Hodge & Allen, stated, disabled people, in particular people with learning disability, autism, or a mental disorder, are particularly at risk of poor health outcomes and discriminatory treatment by health services. And NICE's COVID-19 guideline for clinical care reinforced this. Consequently, it's worth questioning the circumstances in which the clinical frailty scale was created and may be employed. The text accompanying the scale on the NICE website reads, the purpose of this guideline is to maximise the safety of patients who need critical care during the COVID-19 pandemic while protecting staff from infection. It will also enable services to make the best use of NHS resources. While maximising patient safety and protecting staff from infection are essential, the emphasis on making the best use of NHS resources invites us to question whether the guidelines would remain the same if greater resources were available. We might also question whether some lives are being prioritised above others. The final area of change I want to consider in this paper is the impact of the Coronavirus Act 2020 on the Care Act 2014. The Care Act sets out local authorities' obligations to assess residents' needs and provide care which meets those needs. The Care Act also covers standards for care provision, integration between health services and social care, and care education. Prior to the passing of the Coronavirus Act 2020, disability advocacy organisation Inclusion London encouraged people to write to their MPs regarding this act, as it was likely to affect the Care Act. As we see from the Coronavirus Act and its explanatory notes, local authorities' duties and powers to provide care are altered under this act. I'm going to quote from one of the explanatory notes. There are duties on local authorities in Part 1 of the Care Act 2014 to assess and meet needs for care and support. The Act replaces these duties with a power to meet needs for care and support, underpinned by a duty to meet those needs, where not to do so would be a breach of an individual's human rights, and a power to meet needs in other cases. If we examine the wording of this note, we perceive that local authorities are only obliged to provide care for someone if not providing it breaches the person's human rights. A local authority can choose to provide additional care for residents, but this is a power, not a duty. These changes in legislation, including changes in assessments and in the provision of care, are known as Care Act easements, and their use can differ among local authorities. In Scotland, a significant number of local authorities took advantage of Care Act easements, as the BBC Scotland has revealed. The BBC contacted the 31 health and social care partnerships operating across Scotland, and the 23 who responded had all reduced their provision for home visits and care packages. The largest reductions were in Glasgow, minus 34% or minus 1,884 clients, and in Inverclyde, minus 27% or minus 4,589 home visits. Glasgow HSCP stated that it was running at 40% capacity due to staff illness and staff self-isolation, while other HSCPs stated that they had reduced their services to meet critical need only and because more families were able to assist with the care of their relatives. As the chief executive of Glasgow Disability Alliance explained, asking families to take over the provision of care is not a workable solution, as family members may not have the training necessary for care work, and as disabled people may not have relatives who are able or willing to take on a care role. The BBC Scotland article featured a disabled woman, Fern Adams, who lost her 36-hour per week care packages and has been relocated to her mother's house during the pandemic. Fern cannot use her electric wheelchair or her specialised mattress at her mother's house, and she's developed pressure sores as she has to spend 23 hours per day in bed. As the BBC Scotland investigation showed, Fern's case is sadly far from unique. In England, there's not yet been an expose of the extent to which different councils have chosen to use Care Act easements. Local council websites also differ in the information they provide about Care Act easements. I'm going to mention 3 different sites here to show the range of information provided. Coventry City Council explained that they've now paused Care Act easements for assessment and provision of care, but they reserve the right to use them in future. They add that day centres, respite centres, and travel training for people with learning disabilities are all temporarily unavailable. Birmingham City Council's website states that they streamlined services using Care Act easements between 14th of April and 18th of May, but that they have ceased to do so. They state that they continued to provide care and assessments for those with eligible needs during that period, and they do not confirm whether they will use Care Act easements in future. In the case of personal assistant illness, service users in Birmingham who hire their own PAs are encouraged to recruit acquaintances or family members to act as PAs, with the stipulation that if this is not possible, the council can increase direct payments so that a service user can hire a PA from an agency. Liverpool City Council's website does not refer to Care Act easements or stipulate whether changes have been made to the provision of care at home. The site states that care homes are closed to visitors, lists closed day centres, and explains that a mental health service has been closed with all service users safely accommodated. It does not explain where or how service users have been accommodated. From this sample, we can see it may be difficult to obtain transparent information about the use of Care Act easements in one's local authority area. This is likely to be distressing for service users and for their PAs or carers. To recap, local authorities are in control of when they choose to employ Care Act easements and which services they choose to prioritise. Meanwhile, some disabled people in the UK are no longer receiving the care they need to live independently or safely. Although it is positive that councils like Birmingham are willing to increase direct payments to service users whose PAs are unwell or shielding, it is somewhat disquieting that this option seems only to be available if the service user cannot find an acquaintance to take on the role. While staff illness and shielding are out of the control of local authorities, asking family to provide care in lieu of trained staff is unacceptable, as training is often needed for safe, effective care. To conclude, the coronavirus pandemic and the resulting lockdown measures have had a significant impact on UK residents, and especially on marginalised groups. It has been necessary to implement nationwide restrictions to avoid overwhelming health services, and the UK landscape, as well as the world, is likely to be marked by COVID-19 for some time. However, we also live in a landscape marked by ableism, and it's necessary to examine the impact of governmental measures on disabled people in that light. Many disabled people's lives are still shaped by the radical restructuring of disability benefits, and many disabled people will experience additional struggles because of UK lockdown measures. Some disabled people may be worried about the healthcare they might receive due to the clinical frailty scale, while others will be unable to live independently due to the use of Care Act easements. In these cases, disabled people experience a profound loss of autonomy, which, as I have argued, testifies to systemic ableism. Thank you.